It's a beautiful summer's morning and I'm standing in a field just outside the village of Headon in North Nottinghamshire. We're just a couple of miles from the market town of Retford. And years ago I used to drive past here on my way to Retford station, and I remember noticing in the landscape an unusual feature of a long curved boundary hedge. And today we're going to investigate how that hedge actually forms the boundary of the deer park of Headon. You can see behind me the line of a hedge in the far distance, and beyond that two green stripes, a light green and a dark green stripe within the curve of the hedge, and that's the part that was the lost deer park that we're going to investigate. We're going to find out about who created this deer park, the Wasternys family of Headon, a family that was closely supportive of the radical Puritan movement in the late 1500s in this region, the movement that actually turned into the Mayflower Separatists in time. We're going to see how not only did they support radical clergymen, but they created a huge new house in this deer park, and actually a whole lot of avenues, fine avenues of beautiful trees that surrounded their house. Behind me you'll see one tree alone in the field. That is the last tree that remains of one of these great avenues that they created. It's a fascinating story as we investigate the village of Headon. Well, I've now arrived in the churchyard at Headon Parish Church, although that's not quite the right name. It's actually Headon cum Upton, and the village of Headon is quite a dispersed settlement actually. There are 3 or 4 little hamlets scattered around this parish church. One is Upton, which is about 3/4 of a mile away. There's Headon Thorpe, which is over in that direction, and there's Nether Headon that we're going to go down to later. And the church is just positioned on one of the highest bits of ground between these different little settlements. It's a church with a fascinating history. The stranger thing about it though was that it had both a rector and a vicar for many, many centuries. And of those two, the vicar was the one who did all the work, and the rector had no responsibility at all. He simply collected his share of the income. And so we get the word sinecure. A sinecure is Latin for without cure, without the cure of souls. You probably know the word curate. So if you had the job of rector here, you had a job that was a job for life with no work. Sadly, that no longer applies because they abolished it in the 1880s when they merged vicar and rector together. But an odd history for a church such as this. This church was once much bigger than it is now, reflecting the fact that Headon in centuries ago was really quite an important village. And you can see here evidence of work being removed, and in fact on the other side as well. And the church has also got a rather unusual stumpy tower, and there's quite an amusing village legend about this, that the tower was really meant to be much bigger, but then the Black Death came along and they never finished it. I don't think that story is true because of the age of things, but nonetheless we like a good story like that. So let's go inside and hear about this family, the Wasternys family, and their role in making this a centre of Puritan radicalism in the late 1500s. Well, this is a lovely old church, and actually this is one of my favourite things here, this rather wonderful face watching over the congregation. Well, we're now inside St Peter's, of course, and it's a fine old church, much smaller than it would have been at one time, and it dates right back to, of course, early medieval times. And one of the treasures of this church is the tomb of Simon de Headon, as he's known locally, who's in the corner over here. But I'm going to find a comfortable place to sit down and talk about really the great era of this church, when it was one of the leading churches in the radical Puritan movement in North Nottinghamshire, a movement that actually became, of course, the Mayflower Pilgrims. The interesting family that dominated this area for several hundred years were the Wastons family, and they took possession of Headon through marriage in 1329. They don't always seem to be in a particularly well-behaved family, and there's a famous example of somebody being attacked by the Wastons and their henchmen on the road between here and Grove, and only being rescued because somebody at Dame Hersey's watchtower spotted that a murder seemed to be taking place on the public highway. So they were perhaps a bit of a disreputable crew at one time. But later on, they clearly changed their spots because they became ardent supporters of the Puritan cause. And this church is very interesting because of its connection to radical Puritanism in the late 1500s and early 1600s. For example, we know that the vicar here, John Swinscoe, was deprived in 1567 for nonconformity, one of the earliest deprivations to take place. What is particularly interesting about John Swinscoe, though, is that after being deprived here, he ended up as vicar just a few miles away of Marnham. And at Marnham, that was the church that Richard Clifton, who became the spiritual leader of William Brewster and William Bradford, one of the key separatists who went to Amsterdam, that was the church that he followed Swinscoe into the pulpit of before going off to achieve fame through his preaching at Babworth. So here we have a very early example of a radical Puritan with some fascinating connections to the later Separatists. But that's not all that happened here. In 1589, the next vicar, Thomas Hunt, he was frequently in trouble for refusing to use the prayer book and other breaches of law. And then in 1605, Robert Southworth was deprived. And Robert Southworth was the vicar here, and he was deprived one of the group of 4 or 5 leading schismatics in North Nottinghamshire that included Clifton, Richard Bernard and Henry Gray at Bawtry, who was closely connected with Brewster. So he was a really important person being deprived. Now, actually, Southworth was, amongst the Nottingham clergy, the one man who was most often in trouble with the church court. 9 times he was cited for various problems and misbehaviours, more often than anybody else in the county. So he was clearly the Wastons man, and the church did what it could to remove him from this parish. What did he do after that? Well, within a few weeks, he seems to have turned up at Scrooby, no less a place, where he was in trouble for acting as curate, clearly arranged through the good auspices of William Brewster. And Southworth was a friend of other important separatists like John Smith and Richard Bernard. There's a reference to them having a conversation while walking along the highway together. And he was eventually excommunicated by the Church of England in 1607. So after he'd gone, what did the Wastons family do? Well, they controlled the patronage of the parish. They could pick who they wanted to have as a vicar. And the next man they chose was Thomas Hancock, who was vicar here from 1605 to 23. When they chose Hancock, they knew exactly the sort of man they were getting, because where had he been previously? He'd been curate at Scrooby. He also actually had been vicar at West Retford, which under the care of the Denman family was one of the main Puritan churches in the region as well. So he was a man who was intimately connected with the radical fringes of the local Puritan movement. In fact, while he'd been at Scrooby, he'd got into trouble for holding an unlicensed marriage service. And the 2 people who he married were none other than Robert Southworth, the previous vicar of this parish, and Jane Wastons, a daughter of the Wastons family of this parish as well. So you can see that all of these people were an intimately connected group, and that this parish church was very much a part of that. Although Hancock didn't get deprived and managed to stay here for many years, he did quite often get into trouble. And in 1620, he and 25 others were fined for a riot here, probably over a church issue one would imagine. In 1623, he moved parishes from here to Todwick, another parish that was in the control of the Wasternys family. So you've got all these fascinating people connected to Headon Church, people who were intimately connected with the world of Richard Clifton, William Brewster and John Smith, the Separatists who actually left England over those few years around 1608 and moved to Amsterdam. This church isn't on the Mayflower Pilgrim Trail, but perhaps it really ought to be. There aren't many memorials to the Wasternys family in this church. One of them's under the carpet, but this one is on the wall. And for the next part of our film, this is particularly interesting because this is the memorial to Sir Hardolph Wasternys and his wife, Dame Judith. And these are the people who built the stately home in the middle of the deer park at Nether Headon. So that's where we're going to go next, to find where these two people built the house that now has entirely vanished. And perhaps we'll find out what happened to it. As you can see, the church is built on the traditional high point in the local landscape, what passes for a mountain top in North Nottinghamshire. We're off now across the fields to find the other part of Headon where the manor house and later the stately home were. So there's a few fields, a couple of stiles, and then we'll be there. Right, looks like another stile built for giants. I think it must be about 8 foot tall to get up on there in one go, but I'll do my best to get over without an embarrassing accident. And then we'll carry on down here. We're now about halfway between Headon, Upper Headon with the church, and Nether Headon with the manor house. In fact, you can just see the manor house behind me, or manor farm actually, because it was rebuilt as a tenanted farm in the 18th century and the 19th century. And I'm on the footpath that connects the two. I love old footpaths. You know, this path has probably been used for hundreds and hundreds of years by the people in the village going from one side to the other, long before there were tarmac roads and all that sort of thing. We've now reached the area of Lower Headon or Nether Headon, and this is a fascinating place in its own right. This field here was once a village maybe 30, 40 or more houses, now completely gone. And it's classified as an official historic record as a deserted medieval village. Where did it go? Rural depopulation, Black Death? We can't be quite sure. So now we just have to imagine the little houses that were once here. The people who got up on a Sunday morning and walked up the hill to their parish church half a mile away. Well, we've got a bit of a curious thing here where the public footpath sign appears to point us through somebody's garden, but of course public footpaths are hundreds of years old, and more or less here is one of the main entrances to the old deer park. Houses and gardens have come along years later, so if we go through here we should eventually get to this mysterious park. At last we're coming into the deer park, Headon Park. So I'd like you to imagine if you were a gentleman living in Tudor England back in 1500, a man of wealth, a man of status. What could you buy for yourself? Sadly, there were no super yachts, there were no Rolls Royces, there were no Lear jets, none of those sorts of things. If you were a gentleman who wanted to show his place in society, what you needed was your own private deer park. And so that's what George Wasternys decided to do here in about 1505. Probably he had to remove some of the agricultural fields and therefore deprive local people of their livings at the same time. Maybe that's why the old village here has largely disappeared. But so he created himself a park here, stretching across the countryside, where he could keep deer and hunt and sport to his heart's content. Unfortunately, he failed to get the right legal permission. And so the reason we know about this is because in 1505 to 6 a legal inquisition was held in Retford to investigate his illegal creation of a deer park, chaired by none other than the Abbot of Rufford. And even after that, it wasn't a smooth ride. For example, a couple of Sir John Hersey's men from over at Grove were in trouble for trespassing in his park and stealing his deer. But we shouldn't think that George was always the innocent party, because there's another famous occasion when one of the gentry of Gamston, Edward Thurland, had to sue him for the return of his son, which was a complicated arrangement to do with Edward Thurland's son marrying George's daughter, and he wouldn't hand him over back to his parents. So a strange time. But of course, deer parks went out of fashion after a while, and by 1700 or so, when Sir Hardolph Wastons was in charge, he had a different idea of fashion. A man of the 18th century needed a landscape park with a nice stately home in the middle of it, and so George's Park was adapted. And behind me you can see in the distance a tree, one of the last remaining signs of the great avenues that Sir Hardolph had planted across George's deer park. So we're going to go and investigate those a little bit more closely. If you're interested in the history of the English landscape, this is just such a fascinating place to be, because you can really find traces of layers of different landscapes layered on top of each other, and the evidence is there when you know what you're looking for. So now, of course, I'm well inside George's Deer Park. It stretches for hundreds of acres around me, but if I look over to this side, what I can see is the curved boundary hedge coming round to mark this corner of the deer park, and of course that goes in a vast circle round behind me. And then immediately behind me, you may think this is just an obscure tree. Well, it's actually part of an avenue of walnut trees that Sir Hardolph Wastons had planted here, and from here the road led down into the village of Headon. You may look at this and say, well, it's hardly an avenue, there's only one tree, and of course that is completely correct. We only have the left hand side of the avenue of trees remaining. The right hand side has completely gone. And a curious thing here is that the public footpath legally actually follows the old line of the avenue. So properly it goes round to the right. But as you can see here, everybody these days goes round to the left. So they're not really following the correct route. And then really over for a half a mile or more in this direction stretched the deer park right over to the hedge in the distance and up to the old medieval road on the hilltop. So here I am. You can see the line of trees that was on one side of the avenue. There would have been another line of trees on this side, and here should be the footpath. But really, I don't think I'm going to get very far along this. Most people go the other side. Even Sir Hardolph's landscape, though, is gradually fading away. So we've lost one side of this avenue of walnut trees, and even the other side is gradually fading away. You know, these trees are 1710 probably, and as you can see, this one has come down relatively recently. In fact, this one's quite interesting because it used to have the public footpath sign on, pointing to the correct side of the avenue. Now the tree's fallen down and the signpost presumably is somewhere underneath here. So there's nothing to keep us on the right course of the old avenue. Well, this is really just one of my favourite places, and when I brought people here on walks and that sort of thing, you know, they come through what appears to be a gap in the hedge, they think they're going into some woodland, and then they emerge into this beautiful, stunning avenue. Maybe not quite fine manicured lawns of the National Trust, but somehow it's got more romance than that sort of thing. And this is part of the vision of Sir Hardolph Wasneys or Wasneys in the early 1700s. Now, I've talked about fashion, you know, George, he wanted a deer park because he couldn't have a yacht or anything like that. Deer park's what you had in his day. But by the 1700s, the family status had changed a bit. They'd got themselves a baronetcy, they bought a title off Charles I. It must be said that pretty well anybody who got some cash could do that. They got a title, they needed a house to go with it. And so Sir Hardolph and his wife, Dame Judith, decided to build themselves a new house right in the middle of the deer park and landscape it with these beautiful avenues, of which we've only got little vestiges left. Well, you may look as much as you like, but you won't be able to see the house from here. The house actually stood across the far end of this avenue, but it's vanished. So we're going to go and see, can we find anything that's left of it and what actually happened to this fine house that was built here. This is where the house was, and you can see that as I come over this piece of raised ground, this is actually probably one of the walls of the house, and then I can dip down here. Perhaps this is where the cellars were at one time, and if I carried on a few yards, there's another raised bank the other side. This is a house that nobody's got any known picture of or map of or anything at all. We can only use our imaginations here to think what it would have been like. And it was a house that sadly was fated only to be lived in by one generation, because Sir Hardolph and Dame Judith never had any children of their own. They didn't have a family to fill their new home with, and so they left all their property to a niece, Letitia Berry. By the time actually these things became really significant, Letitia Berry had already married into the Eyre family of Rampton, and the Eyre family then bought Grove Estate, which is just about a mile from here. So Letitia Berry would have already known that she really didn't need two stately homes within a mile of each other. And so Sir Hardolph died. His wife, Dame Judith, lived on for a few more years till about 1769, and after that this almost brand new house was redundant. And so a few years after her death it was demolished and everything of value was taken away. But maybe we can find a few other little mementos of what used to be here. Now, of course, a house like this would have had gardens, you know, beautiful garden around it. Maybe we can find some evidence of that sort of thing as well. So I'm now going to go and investigate in the trees over behind all this cow parsley. As you can see, I appear to be rather lost in the bushes, or at least lost in the woods. And that's because I'm looking for the lost gardens of Headon. Because Sir Hardolph clearly had a plan when he built his house here. And I'm actually standing just beyond those old foundations that we saw in the grass a few minutes ago. And you can see the ground here drops quite dramatically to where I am. He built his house on a hillside south facing, and clearly what he did was to get his men to work on this hillside, to dig out where I am standing and to pile it up behind me, to put the house in a higher position. And you'd think probably that where I am now was the garden. You can imagine they laid out a formal garden here where they intended to enjoy life with their children. Sadly, there never were any children, and most of the time it would have been Lady Judith living here after her husband died in 1749. So you can imagine her in the formal gardens, perhaps, looking south into the sunshine with a life that was sadly quite empty. And so it's a bit of a sad place, a lost place, but a romantic place, the lost landscape of Headon. We've now come to the other side of where Sir Hardolph's stately home was, and we've come to a place where we can really appreciate how the 1500s deer park and the 1700s stately landscape were layered on top of each other. Firstly, really, just to my left here, this is the remains of one of the avenues. It's a particularly significant avenue because this one connected the Wasneys house here with the Eyre family's house at Grove. This was the direct connection between the two, and it's perhaps the best preserved avenue as a result. Behind me, you can see a dark green field and then the lighter green field. Those are the two fields that we saw from the hilltop at the beginning of this video, the fields that are within the deer park. And actually curving all the way behind those, the first hedge that you can see behind me is the hedge that must have been put up by George Wasneys in 1503, the deer park pale as it was called. And that hedge therefore is very, very historic and interesting hedge, and almost complete in this section. And then within that, just over here, we've got a clump of trees marking the site of a pond. Perhaps this was a pond that Sir Hardolph had put in to make his estate look more attractive, and that survived today. But the avenue that went off this way and the avenue that went off across that way, they've both gone. Just the odd tree might be left as a sign. I'm now back between the foundations of Sir Hardolph's house here at Headon, and we haven't been able to find anything of it at all. But right in the middle of where the house was is what was a school. And you might think, well, what is a school doing here? Where could the pupils possibly have come from? And it's a school with a very interesting history. It was financed by the heirs of Grove and their successors, the Harcourt Vernons, who controlled both the parish of Grove and the parish of Headon. And perhaps because Methodism started to make inroads into the area, they decided that they were going to fund a school for 12 poor pupils of these two parishes that they controlled. And perhaps because they didn't want to build two schools, they decided to build one to serve both parishes. And they chose to put it not in one village or the other, but dead in the middle between the two. And so we have the school for Grove and Headon being opened here in the middle of an empty park, no children around at all, and all the children therefore had to walk a mile to school and a mile home every night. That way if you lived in Headon, that way if you lived in Grove. And for a while, of course, it then became the home of a schoolmaster. Sometimes there was a couple who lived here. You know, we've got the schoolroom, a little cottage attached, until probably about 1906, when education had changed a great deal and a new school was built in Headon. So it's now a private home. It's being beautifully restored by a fantastic couple who really respect and love the heritage here, and so we've got no worries that this is going to be lost, this part of our heritage. And in fact, while they've been doing the restoration, they've found a few pieces of stonework from the lost mansion of Headon, and this proves that it's not just a fantasy, it's the actual best evidence we've got that it really existed at this site. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our exploration of the story of the village of Headon, its radical Puritans and the lost landscapes of Headon Park. I've had a fabulous time. If you've enjoyed our video, don't forget to like us and subscribe, and also don't forget that you can read more of these stories in our books. People and Places of Bassetlaw has these stories in. We've got lots of stories about the Puritans in Restless Souls, Pilgrim Roots, and From Here We Change the World. So you can keep up with us through print and through media. Hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm heading off now back to Headon and my car by the church.